Hello everyone, how are you? I'm Mari Theriger and today I'm going to talk about death in animism. Although I should say that I'm not going to focus on death as a process of transformation of the self and a personal shift of realities, because I think that has been addressed many times before. Today I would like to speak of death as indeed a process of transformation, but more on the level of transformation of relationships and how does that affect the human being and the great transformations within human social groups provoked by the inevitability of death. Death as a process of transformation of relationships, as a force that drives human creativity, leading to a series of ritualistic behaviors that form the basis of several important celebrations within culture, and also the construction of objects that help interact with various entities, especially ancestors, but also help to maintain relationships. Before we start, I just want to share a few quick words. It's for your own benefit, I believe. I'll put a marker on the video itself, so if you want to skip it, please go ahead. Well, it has recently come to my attention that some people have been accusing me of plagiarism, and also that my videos are filled with unverifiable personal gnosis, which is odd and rather unfair, but you tell me what you think about it. You may have noticed that many of my videos have a bibliography at the end, so you can explore for yourself the subjects I share with you in this channel, as well as the sources of study that help me to compose my videos. It's true that my older videos don't have references aside from the names of specific sources I would usually put on the screen when dealing directly with the study of those sources. This is YouTube, and I was getting started, so it never occurred to me to place the bibliography until people started to ask for sources, and since then I have provided them. Not all of my videos need a bibliography because, for instance, my rune videos are my own esoteric interpretation of the runes, and I've made that clear several times. I have made plenty of disclaimers, and the academic works on the runes are on a different folder separated from the esoteric ones. Also, I do not place bibliography usually when speaking about philosophy and the study of modern age religious manifestations, especially the latter because they are modern religious manifestations, so there are no sources yet, so my approach is showing you what's out there and starting a study on them by interviewing people, asking questions, get insight quite literally, and then I express and share with you what I have learned. But the great majority of my works have a bibliography, and even if by any chance I forget to place it in the video itself, look for the comments or descriptions of my videos, and in there I also place sources. However, I must say, and this will be quick and we shall get right into the video, my videos on animism and shamanism have no bibliography. It's true, aside from what I share with you in the comments. In terms of shamanism, it's rather difficult to give you concrete sources of other authors, as shamanism isn't a scientific study per se, but rather the very personal experiences of communities' spiritual leaders and what they pass on to a variety of people that come directly in contact with them. Such is the case of anthropologists who have no primary sources because they themselves become the sources of study when interacting directly with native indigenous communities. The problem is that the great majority of anthropological works concerning shamanism and animism as a whole are quite biased, and usually from people of Western societies who end up interpreting things as it suits them and under their own beliefs and perceptions of realities. As much as I enjoy reading old works, I don't see them anymore as reliable sources of information, and they can be quite misleading. I have been recently creating contact with some indigenous peoples on very few occasions, face to face actually, which was a privilege and very important to me. So I have learned a lot, and I've shared with you what I've learned. But I cannot really show you sources on that, as these are real people with real names and families, and simply saying that I have had contact with them isn't enough to support my claims. And even saying this right now, many of you don't believe it, so why bother? The problem, the great problem, is that there aren't enough indigenous peoples within studies of indigenous communities, sadly, but things are slowly changing, and progressively more indigenous peoples are being integrated in the academic field. And that's really good, really good. That's awesome. But until then, I still prefer direct conversations with them, interviews, and also sources from the part of those who work directly with them, rather than go for the older sources, usually even from the perspective of people who are simply writing based on hearsay. However, there are a couple of sources, indeed literary sources, more recent sources I have been studying, and on today's video I have decided to place a bibliography so you can explore. I had before shared with you sources on animism, so this isn't something new, but for today's video, like the ones before, I have also relied on literary sources. Even though they are quite limiting, as a scientific study on animism and shamanism simply isn't possible, precisely because we are dealing with very real customized belief systems of human communities, and things aren't black and white. But indeed, I'll start to also place sources for the videos on animism and shamanism. Although, please take in mind that both the sources and my own videos are just a tiny approach to these subjects, trying to deliver as much information as possible from realities with endless perceptions and understandings. The sources won't help you to grasp everything there is to know about animism, but will certainly give you a hand or a push. So, like myself, please continue on exploring these subjects, and together we will certainly come to even more conclusions and more precious knowledge. Now, enough of that. Let's start our today's video, my dear friends. Please. So, death as the transformation of relationships. When we deal with animism, no matter what culture and many branches of beliefs we take, we end up always coming about the respect for life as the foundations of animism. And in that respect for life, we find the very thing that makes animism what it is, which is the animation of life, possessing life, attribution of life in order to detect personhood and the relationships that are possible to build with animated life forms. From the moment life is animated, it is possible to create a relationship with the animated life. Therefore, animism is very much about the relationships between persons of the world, be those human persons, animal persons, other than human persons, and so on and so forth. The important aspect to take in mind is that relationships are created, established, and maintained. However, life isn't static and is always evolving, changing, and growing. Anything that is subject to the animation of life will be subject to death as well, eventually. Life is always changing, and that forces relationships to also change. Although when death comes, the change is much more sudden, even unexpected, and quite abrupt. The relationships we create with one another and with our surroundings will be subject to change due to the very changes in the environment itself, but also due to a variety of circumstances that compose life. But we try our best to maintain relationships that are important to us. But when death is present, our efforts to maintain a relationship with the life that passed through death will be far more difficult. And the entire behavior to maintain a relationship with what is dead must also change. We are forced to change our behaviors if we want to maintain relation with the entity or entities that have died. In animism, death isn't understood as the end of existence, but rather a shift of realities and the transformation of existence. However, if in life every existence is subject to change, more so with death. It's not simply a shift of existence, but in animism, the very identity of beings changes upon death, as they become something else, in a different reality that forces the construction of other relationships with others within that reality. Identities change, consciousness changes, and that's when the behaviors of the living have to go through a completely different approach if the living want to maintain a relationship with those who are dead, that before, while alive, a relationship had already been established and maintained. So it's not just a series of behaviors to maintain relationships with those that are important to us while in life, but the efforts to maintain relationships with what dies and shifts reality and identity continues on if we want it to continue. So animism, as the creation of relationships between persons, doesn't stop with death, but rather there must be a transformation of behaviors in order to accompany the new reality provoked by the transformations of death. Let me pick as an example what I have spoken before on the video about the Nordic and Celtic calendars and yearly celebrations, and such celebrations being precisely the effort to build, maintain and renew relationships that are constructed throughout the year. Perhaps that example may be easier for us of the Western societies to better grasp the impact of death in the transformation of relationships. Seasonal festivals took place at specific times of the year, such as Samhain, as a specific milestone in the year that meant the end of the agricultural year and the beginning of the new year. Annual celebrations which are more noticeable and in greater number in agrarian societies, but also societies that depend on the natural environment to live, which is always subject to various changes and transformations during the year, and which affect the whole of life and force different attitudes and relationships with nature to be able to follow the changes and continue on living. Let us leave aside the more scientific thinking regarding the annual festivals related to the movement of the sun and astronomical events such as solstices and equinoxes. We are going to focus only on the human condition and on an existential and experimental level of life. Purely the interaction of the human being with the world all around and the observation of natural phenomena and natural changes and transformations. Especially following agricultural calendars, human beings build regular and organized rituals to renew communication with the supernatural world. That is, it is an important aspect for the understanding of various peoples and for the maintenance of interactions with the supernatural world and the natural world, which, from an animistic perspective, are not totally disassociated. But rather, the belief is that the world is totally populated by various peoples, the vast majority non-human, and many of these people are also not just animals, but a variety of local spirits, rocks, trees, elves, deities, spirits of weather phenomenon, etc. The festive dates, therefore, included some practices such as, for example, the consecration of beer or mead, a drink produced from the fermentation of honey, dedicated to the most important gods, as well as the performance of animal sacrifices related to the deities and spirits of the land and even to the ancestors. It was customary to offer loot collected in battles, sacred animals, part of the harvest, and other foodstuff and objects to the deities as a form of gratitude. Or the Celts, for instance, another example, had a strong relationship with bees, seen as healers and with a strong connection with the afterlife. So there were a series of rituals towards bees and the products made out of what the bees produced, such as honey, wax candles, beehives, not particular consumption, but again, offerings, but also maintaining the products in one's house, and fortune telling through wax candles and covering hives with a black cloth when a human of the household dies. Or we have the example of Scandinavians, whose relationship with The harvest was, well, important, not just in terms of food consumption, obviously, and sustenance, but the animistic interaction with the spirits and gods of the crops, and a series of pragmatic behaviors, such as offerings to ensure that the harvest was successful. The important thing to take in mind is that people have interaction with others of the natural world, rely on them, build relationships, and the very real products that come out of this relationship are used in different ways to create a link and reinforce those relationships by having a physical object, which is the very thing that helps to bargain and reason with those involved in the relationship. A sense of reciprocity, an important part of the animistic societies, which is the foundations of a gift economy to ensure a successful symbiotic relationship with other than human persons. Building relationships with others in order to successfully create interaction with the spirits and gods for the benefit of the community. And so, picking up the previous example, when the harvest was completed, it wasn't just a portion of the harvest given as offerings to the spirits that have helped in the process of agriculture and the growing of food, but also out of barley and straw, creating images of the gods and images of important spirits who help in fertility of the soils and the growing of food in order to maintain a real physical interaction with such spirits. The creation of straw figures is the pragmatic behavior towards the relationship built with the spirits, and such straw figures made to resemble those spirits, and from this construction of a physical object, the object becomes a sort of talisman to which personhood is given. The spirit of the entity with whom we have created a relationship with throughout the year to acquire something beneficial out of that relationship, such as food for sustenance, such a spirit has a representation, a physical one. So we can maintain this ongoing relationship with the spirits and make sure the spirits or the spirit will continue to help us because we continue to maintain an ongoing relationship. Almost like kidnapping the spirit or the entity, but also giving physicality to the spirit so the spirit may inhabit it and continue to give its blessings and benefits and help within the household, protected within the household during the colder months, and then when the time comes, destroy the physical representation. Let the spirit or entity go out once again. However, by the destruction of the physical representation, the entity dies, ceases to exist in that representation. There is the destruction of physicality, and therefore with this death, the spirit shifts realities again. There's transformation of identity. There's transformation of the existence of the spirit. So it is in this moment that the human community has the need to create ritual and a series of celebratory rituals and pragmatic behaviors in order to renew the relationship with the spirits once again for another year to continue on having their help and benefits. It's like the previous case of the bees among Celts, among ancient Celts. A relationship built and maintained with bees. The bees wax to produce candles, and from this product that comes out of this relationship, other benefits are created. Beneficial aspects are extended within the human community. And not only the wax candles give light, but also a series of behaviors such as using the wax candles for divinatory purposes, because it's a product coming from an animal understood to have a deep contact with the afterlife. So the power of the bees kept in a product made out of what they themselves create, and the human being taking advantage of that power within the very product that creates this link and reinforces the relationship between bees and humans. This is animism. There is no end to relationship unless we want it to end. Death doesn't come to put an end to relationships, but it is an inevitable transformative aspect that forces the transformation of relationships. And in order to maintain, renew, or even rebuild relationships, a series of pragmatic behaviors and rituals have to be created in order to establish or re-establish relationships. And these rituals are the basis of yearly celebrations. It's no coincidence that the great majority of yearly celebrations are during winter. Surely, people were indoors for a longer period and they had to entertain themselves. But winter is a period of death, death in the world, not just the death of crops, but the death of many animals, humans, and even gods. Death forces transformation in relationships. From the moment we build a relationship with the spirits of, let's say, barley or straw, we maintain this relationship. We nurture this relationship the same way we nurture relationships with humans and animals important to us. And from this ongoing relationship, there's something beneficial. However, death comes expected or unexpected, naturally or by accident or even murder. Death is the moment of transformation of relationships. And in that moment, the entire behavior of human communities must change and alter and adapt to the new circumstances. So the barley spirits die with the coming of winter, time to ritualize the renewal of relationships through celebration in order to call upon the spirits of the barley who are now different in their existence because they have died and now they are something else. But they will be needed the next year. So it's not just death that transforms relationships, but it is life as well, in an endless cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. There are several transformations through life. There is the transformation of death and the series of transformations in death until rebirth. This is animism through the observance of the changes and transformation of the natural world every year, every season. The same way nature changes all the time, it is also understood that existence itself, personhood, also changes in endless cycles. And it's those changes that forces humanity to take a series of steps, behaviors, rituals, celebrations, and even the construction of objects in order to create, maintain, and renew relationships with persons that, such as we, are always subject to transformation and shift of realities that force greater efforts to maintain relationships with those that are on different realities and different levels of existence. Since we humans construct several rituals, even for our daily lives, a series of celebrations before and after the main yearly celebrations are a sort of preparation for successful create relationships. Taking an animistic perspective, for human groups whose lives depend on the interaction with the natural world, the transformations of life and nature would have been far more important and taken into these celebrations. So every significant transformation towards a period of rebirth or change would be worth celebrating, since that seems to be the very thing that led to yearly celebrations, especially of an agrarian character. In an animistic perspective, the celebration through ritual is to build, maintain, and renew the relationships that are important for the well-being of communities the year round. And at specific occasions, there's the need to create a celebratory ritual behavior in order to strengthen and perpetuate these relationships that are the foundations of well-being, sustenance, and perseverance, not just of the human communities, but also the communities of other beings within the environment. As I said before, I don't think it is a coincidence that the great majority of celebrations are concentrated during winter time and colder months. Winter is, after all, a period when death seems to be more present, and death, to many animistic societies, is both a transformation, but perhaps more importantly, it is the transformation of relationships. So, in the animistic sense, a relationship built with particular nature's entities throughout the year, when such entities die, let's say spirits of crops, there's a transformation and a shift of relationship as the entities died and have become something else. So there's a need to renew and or maintain the relationship due to this shift. And for that, a celebration or ritual must be carried out to ensure that death won't break relationships, for being such a powerful transformation of entities, perhaps even modifying their identities and characteristics. Rituals turned into celebrations, precisely to maintain and reinforce the connection with nature during a period when there's just too many transformations of identities. And lest the entities of the world forget the relationships that were built due to death, humanity carries out a celebratory or ritualistic behavior or behaviors to preserve beneficial relationships in order to maintain the benefits of such relationships for the next year. So in folklore, as an oral form of transmitting knowledge and information of ritualistic behaviors and purposes, there's these series of meanings and different behaviors because of the different constructions of relationships that were never fixed, never static, but personalized according to whom people built relationships with and according to the fate of each involved in those relationships. I think this becomes clearer if indeed we focus much more on the existential or experienced aspects of living and observing life rather than the scientific implications of it in terms of yearly celebrations, right? Focus on the emotions created by experiencing life and observing the transformations of life, and how those emotions shape human thought and lead to a series of rituals in order to be immersed in life and perpetuate emotions that are significant to us and make us thrive. After all, it all ends up being just that, how we experience and live life and what kind of emotions it gives that will ultimately build our perception. Those emotions are the very thing that connects us to nature's cycles and force us to create ritual in order to maintain ongoing relationships that gives us the type of emotions we thrive on. So the perception of the transformations of life and death indeed has important implications on celebrations and how such celebrations are held towards the fertility aspects of life, the animation of life, the blessings, the very emotions that sustains life, making such time periods worthy of celebration, perhaps more intensely, as they are special on an existential way. I think another good example is precisely what I have shared with you on one of my latest videos concerning the Iberian ancestors' worship and the solar goddess of the dead, in which I have shown you actual Neolithic objects on shale slabs created to perpetuate the identity of the ancestors. In fact, I carry one of those with me. I don't think it's solely a representation of real human individuals to identify them under the artistic patterns of that time period and culture, but also precisely the need to maintain relationships with the dead who, after the transformation of death, became ancestors. And ancestors in animism aren't simply understood to be some sort of spirits or ghosts that maintain a version of their physical appearance while they were alive, but in fact the very conception of ancestors in animism implies that they become more than human persons. I'm not going to develop on this again as I have made a video about it before, early this year, but indeed we must recall that ancestors aren't simply human persons that were once alive. In fact, not every human person becomes an ancestor just because they died. The process of death in animism not only is understood to be a process of transformation of existence, but also a transformation of identity, and there are multiple outcomes. A human being after death not always becomes an ancestor, but some do, and not all ancestors were once human either. The important thing to take into consideration today is that from the moment an entity dies, the transformation process alters their existence and even identity, and there may be forgetfulness of what they once were. Ancestors, for instance, may continue to help their descendants, may continue to give something beneficial to the living. They may even bring knowledge. But the more beneficial aspects of the ancestors can only exist if the living continue to do the efforts to maintain a relationship with them. Because some of the dead, even the ancestors, can be harmful, can even cause a variety of troubles, even cause death, precisely because no relationships are established to set up boundaries and to prevent harmful outcomes. The cult of the ancestors, the cult of the dead, in animism, has this primary function: to renew and maintain ongoing relationships with those that were important to us before the transformation of death, and to prevent harm, illness, damage, and death from those with whom there wasn't a relationship or there is a break in relationship. But now we try to form some sort of symbiotic relationship in order to avoid the more negative impact of the dead, because they are transformed by death. And their identities, characteristics, and even the way of existence are different, which makes them behave differently according to their reality of existence after death, with the process of death. I don't think it's coincidence either, the representation of ancestors on black stones, as the color black in prehistoric Europe at least was understood to be the color of fertility, the color of the soils and the earth beneath our feet. Living humans upon death have their identity carved on these shale slabs, as to remember and identify them after death, because they are no longer living. They have become something else through the transformation process of death and are now related to the earth, spirits within burial mounds that propitiate fertility in the soils, which helps the living to thrive in a period when agriculture was precisely the main activity of the Neolithic economy. This is also something we notice in pre-Christian Scandinavia, when some of the dead become elves as entities of the earth who propitiate fertility precisely because they have become wights of the earth, ancestors who become elves, and thus their new existence is bound to the soils and the fertility or death of the soils. So offerings were important to give to the elves, as some of them are ancestors and can continue to give something beneficial to the living. But in the case of the Iberian Peninsula, the very transformation through which the dead go through modified their very existence and identity. So these representations help both the living and the dead to remember the previous identities, so they may not forget and can continue to help the living now that they have become spirits of the land, of the burial mounds. Could be one explanation. And again, the building of real objects to renew relationships and maintain ongoing relationships. Hence, animism is highly pragmatic. Rituals are symbolic representations. They are moments through which human beings and deities, spirits, ancestors, etc. can meet, and therefore are essential elements for the process of communication between the two worlds to obtain effectiveness. Ritual is related to the process of communication, and this is where the myths originate. Ritual is a tool to get in touch with the others and create and maintain and renew relationships. And here the mythology, just like folklore, serves to preserve the meaning and purposes of ritualistic actions, to preserve knowledge and help generations to maintain relationships from which there is a common benefit to all communities of peoples involved in those relationships. That is why I have said in other videos that most likely the rite or ritual has preceded the myth. Mythology as a tool of communication with the functionality of explaining, ritualizing and obtaining something, since the communication that the ritual seeks to establish always includes an attempt to manipulate the entities from the other world. Myths are created to explain ritual and not myth to construct ritual. Human beings need the intercession of these beings, deities, spirits, to obtain something, be that victory in battles, good weather, good harvest, or simply the knowledge that can be gained from interacting with other non-human beings. Yearly festivals and celebrations, then, are ritualistic moments and have been taking place since before the formal use of calendars. So the most scientific part of the annual celebrations helps us to understand certain cultures and certain behaviors in a specific period, and the building of calendars to facilitate remembering the time periods when it's necessary to perform a ritual. But it is the myths and folklore that help us to understand the human mind and how human beings interact with life and the transformations of the world around us. As I have stated on the previous video about veganism and cannibalism in animism, animism overall is an attempt to live respectfully, to minimize as much damage and harm and death as possible, which means even the process of eating can be turned to the very understanding of animism, which is the respect for life. So one can try to also eat respectfully. Many people on that video understood the message, but some people didn't, precisely because they focused solely on veganism from the very moment I told them I was vegan. So from that moment onwards, they have let their prejudice distort what was being said. For those who think that veganism is a modern thing, the term vegan is a recent word. I believe it was coined recently in the 1940s. But it's just a recent term for an ancient idea of a meatless lifestyle. For those who think that veganism is historically inaccurate, that's on you. There are plenty of evidences of a meatless lifestyle in ancient societies, including classical Mediterranean societies, ancient Egypt, Sumerian civilization, several African and Asian indigenous communities to this day, and even our prehistoric ancestors before the technology of chipped stone tools and the discovery of fire would have a meatless diet, as evidenced by their teeth. And as Dr. Richard Leakey stated, humans can't tear flesh by hand, can't tear hide by hand. Humans wouldn't have been able to deal with food sources that required large canines. So the natural predisposition was towards a plant-based diet. It simply isn't true, the argument that humans have always eaten meat. But I'm not going to focus on veganism now. The point here is that when humans are presented with an alternative, especially in animistic societies, an alternative in food resources that permits them to live by the premise of living respectfully according to animistic beliefs, animistic communities will take that alternative, and their diets weren't and aren't solely involving around meat and death and hunting whenever it is possible to find sustenance through means that do not cause harm and damage and death to others, especially animals, who in animism are understood to be persons. Because the killing of persons forces a transformation of relationships through death that can cause a tremendous amount of harmful outcomes. Still, hunting and gathering and fishing exists within animistic communities, and indeed it's true, a person doesn't have to become vegan in order to be animist, and not every animist person is vegan. It's not a requirement, but it goes with the moral principles of each one and how they want to avoid harming and damaging life. However, animism demands a responsible and ethical reciprocation, precisely because we are involved in relationships with the world, and to live otherwise and take action against the responsibilities towards life is to endanger oneself and others by insulting others through actions that have failed to give respect to life. So this is also important. Veganism in animism is a way to avoid disrespect and harm, to avoid abrupt transformations and alterations in relationships which may affect the community of persons involved and the chain of events that affects more persons as collateral damage from disrespectful actions. After all, Hunting and fishing is causing death, even when it is necessary for the sake of survival and to have sustenance. And animistic societies know this, but sometimes are forced to do this. So when forced to cause death and inevitably cause transformation of relationships, a series of actions must be taken. Death as a transformation of relationships, forcing people to have a certain behavior in order to continue on living respectfully and eating respectfully. We see such examples among Amazonian indigenous peoples. As an example, the eating of persons requires the work of shamans to try to mediate between persons. An animal person is to be killed to serve as food resource for the human community. It is the work of the shaman to mediate between the human community and the community of persons in which the animal required for food belongs to. The death of the animal by hunters must not be at random, or could cause a break of relationships between the human community and the community of the hunted animal, because it angers the animal and it angers the spirits that take care of the community of that animal. Reasoning and bargaining between persons to avoid breaking off relationships through death, to avoid revenge from the part of the hunted animal or its communities or community. The shaman's work here will be to make an exchange, offerings for the food that is offered by the community of animal persons, even reasoning with the entity that governs a specific environment to send forth an animal person willing to be sacrificed for the sake of the human community, or simply the process of death as the transformation of persons into foodstuff. This is when we understand in Amazonian indigenous communities, as a continuation of an example, two important conceptions. The existence of animal shamans that are not human shamans that shapeshift into animals, but rather animal persons who have their own communities and cultures, just like human persons have, and so they live under their own laws, and they too have animals who are shamans. So the reasoning and bargaining between shamans of different communities and species must be established. A relationship must be established and nurtured through the exchange of gifts and offerings as signs of respect, when a life must be taken for the survival of the members of each community. And we also understand the belief that some ancestors become food, in the sense that not all ancestors become spiritual entities or even deities, but some ancestors choose to continuously reborn in specific animals and sacrifice themselves in order to continue to feed and sustain their descendants, who are living human persons. And all of this can only be obtained through relationships that are continuously built. Death being the transformation of relationships, forcing the performance of ritual in order to renew relationships for the benefit of the communities of persons. And through a shaman or shamans, there is the possibility to build new relationships and preservation of already existing relationships. The same thing goes for types of plants. Among Maori, for instance, rituals performed to address the person who is about to be killed, to seek permission for the act of killing. And this involves relationship with trees and vegetation as well, when the necessity comes to kill trees and a variety of plants in order to provide shelter and food. But the willingness to be killed is not taken for granted, but instead, through ritual, humans mediate between persons to seek out permission of or establish who is to be killed or destroyed in order for the human community to have shelter and sustenance. So, in other words, to take lives demands care. What is taken must be replaced by establishing a gift economy between communities in order to maintain relationships. So it is false when some people state that animistic indigenous communities have their lives, economy, politics, laws, religion, etc. around hunting and killing animals as if they were emotionless and lacked empathy. There isn't systemic violence towards animals in animistic communities. Systemic violence is usually in communities who have human interests that leads them to overexploit their surroundings without living a respectfully and ethical life, perpetuating harm, damage, illness and death, forcing the transformation of relationships through death, and no real effort to maintain symbiotic relationships, leading to the creation of several angry entities who seek revenge upon the human communities because of the disrespect towards life through killing. And again, when given alternatives to avoid the killing of animals and trees and certain plants, animistic indigenous communities will take those alternatives. So when veganism is possible, veganism here as the modern term for an ancient and very much historically accurate meatless lifestyle, veganism comes as a very good alternative to avoid the many transformations of relationships caused by death. Not a perfect alternative, but better than most, because the aim is to mitigate as much harm and damage as possible. Again, animism does not require vegan rules and principles, but it's an alternative taken by many indigenous peoples. Of course, not noticeable among hunters and fishers because their work within the community is precisely the killing of specific animals to feed the community according to the instruction of the shaman, who is the person that establishes relationships with the other communities that sometimes are transformed into food. But again, there isn't a systemic violence towards animals and overexploitation of resources within animistic societies. It isn't a war on animals or a war on the environment. However, hunting, fishing, gathering, farming, these activities, one way or another, lead to the death of some entities. And this death is a process of transformation within such activities, leading to the change, alteration and transformation of relationships, which create significant implications in life and how persons relate to one another. So again, it's about minimizing as much damage and harm as possible, whenever possible. Precisely because humans are capable of showing empathy and sensibility towards other life forms and indeed able to relate to such life forms, the killing of animal persons in animistic societies isn't a widespread or consistent behavior, and we see this in the mythologies of animistic societies. The animist culture sometimes, well, there is the necessity to kill some animals, indeed, and because the human person is able to relate to the animals that human person sometimes needs to kill, a detachment is created through mythology. Violence against non-human persons leads to a significant psychological distancing, and this may be one of the reasons why some animals are also turned into mythological beings or strong elements within mythology, especially related to death and hunting and fishing and becoming power animals. Animals become a symbolic importance of certain activities as a form of creating distancing and almost detachment in certain periods when there's the need to kill persons with whom we are able to relate to. Thus, certain animals becoming power animals, and in many occasions hunting in animistic societies becomes an activity apart, far beyond the economic role and far from subsistence. Hunting becoming many times an activity for specific members of the community who seek through hunting the power of their animal kin. More often than not, hunting in animistic societies isn't for the sake of subsistence, unless you either live, of course, in an environment completely devoid of flora and impossible to do agriculture and gathering, and therefore the only way is hunting. Or if the territory is invaded by external societies, such is the case of colonialism, and abruptly changes the lifestyle of indigenous peoples, forcing them to live in restricted areas, losing grounds of natural resources, forced to hunt as the only means of survival. However, aside from that, more often hunting was and is engage for ritual purposes, attaining skills to reassert male and human supremacy, or for the entertainment of the nobility and other groups higher in the hierarchy of human communities, and not always part of the economy or for subsistence. But this too obeys to certain laws and moral principles within the animistic community, because death can become dangerous when it transforms relationships, because death can upset the way things were intended to be and as it has been established. In animistic societies, it is taboo, inappropriate killing of other living beings. Therefore, animism seeks to find alternatives and better and appropriate ways to relate to a wide range of persons. Alright, my dear friends, I do hope you have enjoyed today's video and that it may have been useful in any way. Remember, by the end of this video there's bibliography that you can explore for yourselves. Take notes, seek out the literary sources and enjoy while you explore the endless ways within animism. Take care. Thank you so much for watching, see you on the next video, and as always, thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell.